Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Giobbi, and we're doing an introduction to Erich Fromm, the ideas of Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm has been a very exciting thinker for me for the past, I'd say, 10 years, and I've read the large majority of all of his published works. And what I like about Fromm is that when he was writing from the 1940s up through the late 1970s, Fromm was writing on topics that seem to be more relevant now than perhaps they were then. This is my first attraction to Fromm. The second attraction to Fromm is that he is so accessible. He was a figure of the 1960s counterculture, albeit like Herbert Marcuse, an old man at the time that the young people look towards as a leader of ideas. And the way he writes is just so easy to digest, to get. Complex ideas are presented in very accessible ways, and that's a feature that I haven't found to be true with all of the critical theorists. Critical theory, Frankfurt's critical school. He was part of that school for a period of time until he branched off into directions that were beyond Marx and Freud, which Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, all were pretty attached to the Freudian Marxist idea. So Fromm had a bit of an evolution, and that's the evolution I want to talk about today. So Fromm had an unparalleled ability to write for the public and the ability to express sensitive, complicated, and often paradoxical thoughts in a graspable way. And this was while maintaining an intelligent conversation. Fromm was a man interested in actively incorporating his ideas and making them accessible to the man on the street. Erich Fromm was a central figure of the American counterculture from World War II through the heart of the Cold War era, beginning with his first English title, Escape from Freedom, in 1941, and through his final writings dealing with existential humanism on Being Human, is the title of his book. Erich Fromm created a unique convergence of psychoanalysis, Marxism, humanism, existentialism, and Buddhism. Not holding dogmatically to any one of these life philosophies, he instead mined each for wisdom that could help in coping with the issues of the late 20th century. Influences on Fromm's thinking include the Talmud and the Torah, the teachings of Christ and Buddha, Master Eckhart, and Goethe. His style of thinking was not singular, but rather a plurality of convergences that resulted in a voice that helped to organize the voices for 4 decades of the conscientious. What distinguishes Fromm from other thinkers of his time was his rejection of dogmatism in any form. This free-floating pluralism resulted in a voice truly independent from a school of thought. Most notably might be Fromm's split from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Through Fromm's investigation and rejection of certain core Freudian concepts, he found himself at odds with some of the Frankfurt School's tradition. However, Fromm found this to be an experience of liberation, one in which he could retain much of what he found valuable in the critical theory tradition, while not being chained to it ideologically. The most notable shift in Fromm's thinking came in 1960 texts, Psychoanalysis and Buddhism. As a thinker who would not moor himself to any one central piling, Fromm explored key concepts in the Eastern traditions. Not unlike his German predecessors, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Heidegger, Erich Fromm found Eastern thinking not only to enhance, challenge, and express many of the ideas of the Western tradition, but also to offer a new way of thinking about the issues that we face. Whereas popular figures such as Alan Watts would edify Zen and the Tao, Erich Fromm integrated the Eastern ideas and the Western philosophical tradition. Fromm studied and practiced the life philosophy of Buddhism. However, unlike others, it never became the life philosophy. Today, the meeting of Buddhism and psychoanalysis has become a tradition of its own. This area of thought first found its voice through Erich Fromm. The 1930s through 1960s found Fromm doing most of his American writing. This was a time when academic psychology as well as pop psychology was entranced with American behaviorism. For most academic psychologists, behaviorism was the arrival of psychology as a pure, lawful science. For those psychologists and other thinkers outside of the experimental psychology, behaviorism was yet another manifestation of the Newtonian fantasy. Fromm was not only critical of a dogmatically experimental psychology, but he considered it to be dangerous ideology. Fromm was informed of the dangers of purely experimental scientific worldview through the writings of Martin Heidegger. In The Sane Society, Fromm takes on experimental psychology with Heideggerian sensitivities. The discomfort with academic psychology continued when the cognitive movement began in the 1960s. Fromm became increasingly critical of models that overbearingly reduced human beings to machines, in this instance, computers. Fromm was not alone in his critique of behaviorism and later cognitive psychology. Humanistic psychology was the, quote, third force, quote, that reacted not only against experimental but also psychodynamic psychology. But Fromm was less interested in promoting any one school of thought than he was integrating the schools. He was clearly critical of the movements in America, academic psychology, but he was equally as critical of Freudian psychoanalysis. Although Fromm considered his work to be humanist, he goes as far as to consider Marx to be a great humanist. He is not the typical humanist of the period. Fromm's writings and theories are far more developed and theoretical to be considered next to the typical feel-good representatives of the humanistic movement in psychology, such as Carl Rogers. Fromm formed a convergence of philosophy, economics, theology, psychology, sociology, and political science. His theories and writings are difficult to place in any one academic department and truly contend the tendency to organize thinkers by subject matter. In Fromm's text, we find that being human is a social conglomeration of the philosophical, the political, the emotional, and the spiritual. This, of course, reflects the soil in which he first broke through. Frankfurt School thinkers like Marcuse and Adorno had laid out the interdisciplinary approach. The blending of Freud and Marx was necessarily an interdisciplinary project. Fromm continued this project by reinvesting into man as a spiritual being. Philosophically, Fromm dwells in the group of thinkers that come after the Kantian split. Clearly an existentialist, Fromm is informed not only by Kant but also Heidegger, Hegel, Husserl, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. He finds camaraderie with Spinoza, Master Eckhart, Leibniz, and Pascal, and it is not uncharacteristic for him to draw on ancient Greek thinking. He does not, however, fetishize and romanticize ancient Greece. Instead, he saves this honor for the pre-Enlightenment Europe. Politically and economically, Fromm was a Marxist. However, his radical humanist reading of Marx set him apart from his cohorts. Although he shared this position with the Frankfurt School thinkers, Fromm took Marxist humanism to a new level. In his 1961 text, Marx's Concept of Man, Fromm presents and discusses Marx's early concepts of alienation and private property. Through Fromm's pen, we find these ideas made practical for the 20th century in critical issues of freedom and self based on having. Sociologically, we find Fromm in the company of Marxist theorists. The ideas of Durkheim, de Tocqueville, and Hannah Arendt resonate with the Frommian spirit. Psychologically, Fromm is a psychoanalyst. His rejection of Freud's privileging of sexual drives is monumental and intelligent. His 1935 paper, The Social Determination of Psychoanalytic Therapy, alienated him both from orthodox psychoanalysis and the Frankfurt School harbinger Max Horkheimer. Although Freud had focused on culture, society, and civilization in his later writings, he still held culture to be the sublimation of sexual drives. Fromm did not entirely reject this. He did, however, show that culture had become a greater influence on human beings than biological drives. For orthodox Freudians, this was heresy. But for the new wave of thinkers such as Karen Horney, Erik Erikson, and even Wilhelm Reich, Fromm was a pioneer in social psychoanalysis. Erich Fromm was concerned not only with society and man as an independent subject, but rather of the gestalt of the social person. Man and culture would not be parsed from one another as is customary in social psychology and sociology. Although he did not play out the conversation of man and society and the subject-object split to its end, he did say, as did say Jacques Lacan and the French thinkers of the 20th century, he did introduce a widespread readership to the possibility of that kind of thinking. We can think of Fromm as someone who was completely aware of what was behind the curtain, but realized that pulling the curtain down too quickly would be uneventful. As a psychoanalyst, Fromm understood that nature resists sudden changes, and that to affect culture as a whole, new ideas were best presented in subtle chippings, rather than mammoth blows. In this way, Fromm was much more effective at introducing to the layperson the ideas of Heidegger, Marx, and Adorno, and then have been cultural icons such as Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard. Fromm had an unparalleled ability to write for the public, the ability to express sensitive, complicated, and often paradoxical thoughts in a graspable way, while maintaining an intelligent conversation. Fromm was a man interested in actively incorporating his ideas and making them accessible to the man on the street. The issues that occupied Fromm's thinking manifested during the pre-Nazi modern world of political fascism through the post-Vietnam War, postmodern world of cultural marketing. His writings deal with individual freedom in the age of political fascism through the age of technology. Many of his concerns continue to be the concerns of today, and where much of his thinking was premonitory, most of it has become more relevant than it was when it was written. Overshadowing the issues of Nazi fascism, the American Civil Rights Movement, cultural colonialism, the wars in Korea and Vietnam, and corporate fascism was the impending promise of atomic annihilation. The atomic question took center stage for much of Fromm's life and became the most urgent issue to be addressed. But behind this external threat of a nuclear apocalypse was another issue of the problem of technology. Fromm was equally as concerned with the ideology, technology, politics, and capitalism as he was with the atomic bomb. For Fromm, President Eisenhower's warning of a military-industrial complex, a corporate incentive to go to war, was as threatening to mankind as the bomb. At the foundation, however, of Fromm's concerns was a person's relationship with herself. Based on the human need for a sense of self, Fromm described a modern social personality that was alienated from an authentic life and enmeshed in an ideology of consumerism. Fromm's best-known book, To Have or to Be, is an exploration into the trend of basing one's sense of self on what they have rather than on what they do. This is the Fromm that dealt with ideology and complex intersections of politics, economy, culture, and psychology in what is called personality. Erich Fromm is a name that has not become forgotten, but perhaps has become overlooked. In the 20th century, Fromm remains accessible, clearly written, and concise, and it makes him very readable by the non-professional thinkers. His ideas were comparable to those expressed by his Frankfurt School colleagues, but did not assume or require graduate degrees to read. For this reason, a generation of revolutionaries came to embrace Fromm's texts, while academic and public intellectuals have bypassed him for the more obscure writings of Marcuse, Adorno, and Max Horkheimer. Even those German, French, and American writers of post-structuralism hold much in common with Fromm's writings. If not for his clear and understandable style. For this reason, Fromm has been neglected by the Academy and forgotten by the aging generation of 1960s radicals. Erich Fromm's thoughts and teachings are increasingly relevant to the issues of today. We will find that many of the issues remain, in addition to new manifestations of old problems. Much of his thinking, based on 3,000 years of intellectual history, is timeless and reflects the core issues of human existence. What is unique about Fromm is not only how he presents his thoughts, but also how he organizes and constructs them. Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Giobbi, and we're continuing our discussion of Erich Fromm. Today we're going to focus on Fromm's marketing character type. So when Jean-Paul Sartre described a life lived in bad faith, he was not speaking so much of dishonesty or destructiveness to others, but rather a dishonesty to oneself. The bad faith examined by Sartre is the life lived in what Heidegger called fallenness. Heidegger described the person who has become lost in culture, buried so deeply in the layers of the social that the authentic self is concealed. Heidegger does not isolate the self from culture. However, he does describe authenticity as a remembering or awareness of the identification with culture. This is the soul of Sartre's bad faith, a life completely forgotten in the isolated spectacle of the manufactured desire, what we today would understand as marketing and spectacle. Sensationalism. Nearly 70 years ago, Erich Fromm described a panorama of bad faith found in contemporary American society. Whereas Sartre spoke of bad faith in a general way, Fromm identified and described a taxonomy of social personality patterns. Although these descriptions were made in the post-war heyday of consumer America, they are more prevalent now than ever before. The character orientation of American society clearly illustrates our cultural evolution from Homo sapiens to what Fromm called Homo consumens, man who thinks versus man who consumes. Man's main task in life is to give birth to himself, to become what he potentially is. The most important product of his effort is his own personality, writes Fromm. The ways of being in society and ethics of adaptiveness in Man for Himself, Fromm describes 5 character styles that are of bad faith. In speaking of these 5 ways of being, Fromm uses the term character. Although this term has become demonized in contemporary objective trait theory, the term necessarily includes ethics as a core of who we are. This is character versus personality. From Fromm's 1947 text is subtitled An Inquiry into Psychology of Ethics. The point here is a vital one. A personality theory that is value-free is necessarily free of value. Purging ethics from the human removes the distinction between the species, the thing that makes Homo sapiens sapiens. Character is an adaptive quality or orientation that arises from a specific environment. Evolutionary psychology calls this the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, the EEA. Personality, however, must be considered not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the attitude one takes towards the EEA. In this way, we have a very complex interaction between the EEA, attitude, and style of being. Some of this, of course, is deliberate, calculated, intentional, but most of who we are is completely habitual, unconscious. As both a product and producer of our social and political environment, we can see the traits of individual character in the political and social milieu of the EEA. There is no better archetype of culturally manifestation of character than that of contemporary America and what Fromm called the marketing character. The Industrial Revolution introduced the ability to produce massive surplus. Unlike the artisan who would be individually employed to produce a particular table or chair for a specific patron, the mechanized factory can mass-produce replicated identical goods in such quantity that no weight is necessary for the consumer. However, this changed the dynamic between producer and consumer, from an individually produced article for a unique customer to a mass-produced product for an abstract consumer. When supply exceeded demand, demand itself needed to be manufactured. This was the birth of marketing, the manufacturing of desire. It was not long until human beings, categorized as either blue or white-collared, became commodities themselves. The Industrial Revolution and mass marketing of products cultivated an EEA in which human beings themselves became commodified products with a market value. This is most evident today in the corporate human resources department. In contemporary America, we cease to be people and instead become brands, commodities, or resources to be bought, sold, and consumed. Growing up in this EEA makes one oblivious to it. This is known as captivation and acceptedness, the state of not considering to question the taken for granted conditions of existence. The contemporary zeitgeist of American culture is that of the marketing orientation. The objective of the American education system is not to encourage innovative, dynamic, and radical thinking, but rather to produce marketable job candidates. The result of this shift from "I am what I do" to "I am what I will sell" is evident in the advertising and media images that are used as icons of success. The celebrated image of the survival of the fittest business person, like Donald Trump, or the vacuously hollow indifference of the fashion model, is imitated on the street and in the office. Although we do not personally know these celebrities, we rely on their image to teach us how to be, or appear to be, successful. A basic need of human being is a sense of identity. The marketing character comes to understand herself not by what she is, but rather by what others think of her. Fromm proposes that prestige, status, success, and notability are the basis of the marketing character's sense of self. I will argue that today it is not only merely success, status, and notability that is important, but rather it is the appearance of these qualities that makes the marketable self. It is also noticeable of this way of being that as one regards himself as a commodity, he will come to regard others as commodities to be bought and sold as well. Others cease to be people for the marketing character and are instead a means to an end. The marketing character does not have a human exchange with others, but uses others as she uses products. The marketing character style is a phenomenon of contemporary American culture. This life orientation is unique to the social and political climate of post-World War II America. It is a way of being that orients itself not on what one is, but rather on what one appears to be. Erich Fromm and Theodor Reich on dogma. The Dogma of Christ, 1930. In 1955, Erich Fromm reluctantly published an essay he had written as a student while he was 30 years old. The topic was a psychoanalytic discussion of Christ inspired by his teacher, Theodor Reich. Whereas Reich made a traditional analysis of the individual Christ, we find here a young Fromm who takes a social psychoanalysis some 5 years before his official proposal of the approach as presented in the Social Determination of Psychoanalytic Therapy. In The Dogma of Christ, Fromm discusses the function of religion as a substitute for real satisfaction and as a means for social control. Understanding ideology and dogma, Fromm examines the life of the individual who develops the ideology rather than how the ideology influences the individual. In this way, ideology is a product of the socioeconomic conditions within which a person functions. In his 1950 foreword to the first English publication, Fromm writes, "The main emphasis of this study is the analysis of the socioeconomic situations of the social groups which accepted and transmitted Christian thinking." We find in this essay what Fromm calls the nucleus of his developed theory of ideology. The year of writing of the Dogma of Christ was 1930. Fromm found completing his psychoanalytic training and becoming associated with the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. This writing was made 5 years after completing his doctorate, which examined the function of Jewish law in maintaining social cohesion in 3 diaspora communities. Whereas Fromm's childhood and formative years were steeped in Jewish theology, his sociological interests continued to explore the function of belief and spirituality in the social person. With his first psychoanalytic writing, we find the same theme, only now interpreted through the Freudian lens. But even in this early essay, 9 years before Freud's death, Fromm is beginning to challenge the core Freudian assumptions about sexuality and culture. Here we find a Fromm that is somewhat reverent of Freud, but not completely comfortable in Freudian ideology. The text is an overture to the thinking done in his 1935 paper, The Social Determination of Psychoanalytic Therapy, as well as the later lecture and writings, Psychic Needs in Society in 1956, Dealing with the Unconscious in Therapeutic Practice in 1959, The Relevance of Psychoanalysis for the Future in 1975, and Psychoanalysis and Religion, his writings in 1950. Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Giobbi. We're going to continue our investigation of Erich Fromm, and this is going to be a broad overview of Fromm's life's work. And the way I'm presenting it is organized in a way that tries to condense early, middle, and late Fromm into one general theory. His thinking changes over his lifespan, so ideas that he discussed early in his life could be rejected or altered or embellished in the middle and later years of his writing, and terms that he used earlier in his theory have changed in the middle and later parts of his theory. So I'm going to try to parse all that out. What I found from teaching Fromm in the classroom, firstly, is that students are hungry for his message. As we discuss Fromm, more and more students recognize that his ideas, written in the 1940s, sometimes in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, he died in 1980, are maybe as relevant or more relevant now than when Fromm was writing. What he was sensitive to in the early to mid 20th century has become just the everyday fabric of American culture today, and maybe so much so that we are unable to see it because we're swimming in it. Fromm helps us to recognize it, to see it. I like to start with the quote. Erich Fromm said, "In the 19th century, the problem was that God is dead. In the 20th century, the problem is that man is dead." And I think this is the central message that Fromm has, his unique combination of Judaism, psychoanalysis, Marxist theory, existential humanism, and Buddhism. This unique mix brings him to pointing out that the main crisis today is an overemphasis with the Enlightenment tradition of objectivity, the privileging of mathematics and logic and statistics and objective empirical data over the human phenomenological subjective experience. And Fromm warns us that our approach to how we understand the human condition in psychology has become so positivistic, based in behaviorism, based in cognitive psychology, which in cognitive psychology, the model for the human condition is the computer. Information processing, short-term memory, long-term memory, the brain is the hardware, the mind is the software, input, output, processing speeds, working memory. This is all computer language that we now describe human beings as. We take it for granted that there's a long-term, short-term memory. This is one model, a computer model, an AI model of the thing we call memory. Fromm is warning us that in discussing human beings in this way, that we begin to see ourselves as machines, as automatons. It's when Fromm was describing this, it was novel. Today, there's a certain captivation and an acceptedness that the brain is a computer. We talk of things being hardwired, etc. This is what Fromm means by, in 20th century, the problem is man is dead. When we're cut, we don't bleed. We create sparks. Is his warning. An interesting aspect that I find in Fromm is we find him in some theories of personality psychology textbooks, but because he did something so interdisciplinary, psychologists are often not at home with Fromm, viewing him as a sociologist. In the sociology departments, of course, Fromm is viewed as a psychologist. He transcends disciplinary categories, departments, and therefore he's overlooked in these departments. So we find that his unique approach, one of a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, a social critic, a philosopher, an anthropologist, a former member of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, a Buddhist psychologist, we find that this makes him very unique in his perspective. One example of this is his text that came out around 1975 called The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. This is a 500-plus page investigation of human aggression. I know of no book today that is more relevant to the issues that we're having in school shootings and mass shootings than The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. The book is a comprehensive review of all of the literature, from Stanley Milgram to Philip Zimbardo, to biological, to behavioral, to evolutionary models of aggression, psychodynamic, humanistic. All the models of aggression are looked at in this text, in these 500-plus pages. It's so comprehensive. And the book is largely unread today in the university classroom. It's part of the reason that I'm introducing Fromm, because I believe that he is so important for today. Some of his major themes: society and culture, not biology, makes the person who they are. Fromm differed from Freud in that Freud felt that culture was a manifestation of sublimated sexual desires. In other words, sexual desires is what Freud described as biologically based. It's biological drives. Fromm disagreed with this. Fromm said that we as human beings have transcended biological drives, and that the pressures of the sex drive is much less influential than social drives, social pressures for prestige, for power, for acknowledgement, for safety and security in a social setting. So for Fromm, one of the central messages is the social influence on an individual rather than the biological influence. And he didn't ignore the biological influence, but he didn't privilege it. We can only find in history the reasons for our loneliness and isolation in the modern world. He took a historical view of the human condition, an evolutionary view. This is historical not only politically and economically, from the modern era, 1600s, and before into the Middle Ages, but also an evolutionary history of the individual, socially. To find meaning in life, we have to escape feelings of isolation and feel a sense of belongingness. For Fromm, the main issue of what we call mental illness is not a sick individual in a healthful society, but a healthful individual in a sick society. For Fromm, symptoms of PTSD, combat fatigue, things of this nature, are not signs of illness, but signs of healthfulness. For example, the individual who comes out of a horrific wartime experience where they have had to kill people or seen people killed or seen their cohorts, their colleagues lose limbs and become injured. For Fromm, the individual who comes out of that experience with nightmares, with panic attacks, is the person who's reacting in a healthful way. He's much more concerned with the individual who comes out of an experience like this unaffected. And this is turning the way we view pathology on its head. For Fromm, depression and anxiety is a symptom of a social symptom, not a problem of the individual adapting to society, but a human flesh and blood reaction to Darwinian capitalism, to survival of the fittest economic and political settings. The freedom that our political and economic systems have brought us has increased our isolation. And for Fromm, isolation, he gets this from Alienation and Marx, isolation brings us not only the ability to be independent, but the negative, healthful consequences of not being open to relying on our neighbors. Recently, there were some weather issues, loss of power, loss of heat in northeastern U.S., and something that was obvious was how people came together to help each other. Neighbors that we typically don't speak to one another or see to each other or go out of our way to see each other are showing concern. How are you? Everyone becomes caring in the moment of need, in the moment of disaster. And what Fromm is telling us is a lot of the symptomology we have of aggression, of anger, of hate, of resentfulness, of jealousy, of distaste for others has to do with our sense of independence. In one point of his writing, he points out that in certain socioeconomic groups, lower income neighborhoods, individual needs a cup of sugar, they go to their neighbor. They sit on the stoop. There's more of a community setting. We have much lower incidences of certain mental illnesses in those communities, he points out. In wealthier socioeconomic classes, we have an independence. If we need sugar, we go to the store, or we hire someone to bake our cakes. That money serves as a buffer between our social interactions. And for Fromm, this is the reason that industrialized and technologicalized advanced cultures have a pronounced level of mental illness. For example, things like eating disorders, anxiety, depression are often found largely in upper middle class socioeconomic conditions. As Fromm points out, eating disorders are not an issue in a culture that's dealing with starvation, such as in the 1980s, Ethiopia in the 1980s, and certain African cultures today that deal with drought and famine. Eating disorder issue is a sociocultural issue. The freedom that our political and economic systems have brought us increase this isolation and increase the negative things that come from isolation, which is a lack of social interest. Too much freedom is a trap of isolation, and our suffering comes from the kinds of societies that we construct. So we see here someone who is a social psychoanalyst. He introduces the concept of social psychoanalysis. Instead of putting people on the couch, he puts culture on the couch, society on the couch, and analyzes it from a psychodynamic perspective. And Fromm researched beyond the psychoanalytic couch into society, culture, politics, art, history, philosophy, anthropology, to understand human personality. One of his earliest best-selling books is Escape from Freedom in 1941, and in this book he discusses how modern Western civilization has achieved more freedom and more independence and has more insignificance, isolation, and depression. We become fascinated with our technologies, with our smartphones, with our text messaging, with the interspace travel. We are amazed and dazzled by the colors of the neuroimaging machines, and we're so impressed with the technology that we lose sight of bigger social issues, and that the technology itself is not a sign of success or advancement in other aspects of our culture. And in many ways, our present day time period is a dark ages, but we don't see this because, as Fromm points out, we're so captivated by the spectacle of the technology. Humans are free of biological instincts and have free will. For Fromm, biological drives are not the major drive of the human condition. It's social constructs. We are also, Fromm bases his theory on free will, the ability to choose. This is much different than other aspects of psychology, where determinism becomes the two options, either social determinism, we call this environmental determinism, we're a product of what we learn, or biological determinism, we're a product of our genes, our brain chemistry. Fromm embraces the existential humanist model here and talks about free will. This obviously comes from Freud as well. In Freud, we had the distinctions between, in the Latinized version, the id, the ego, and the superego. And of course, the id represents biological drives. The superego represents the cultural pressures, social pressures. And the ego represents free will. So this is nothing new. And it's also helpful us to consider Freudian theory in that way, instead of getting bogged down in the mystical words that Freud never used, incidentally, of id, ego, and superego. The me, the punitive me, the over me, and the thing, the it, the id. So these are just representing biological influences on the human being, social influences on the human being, and free will of consciousness. Now these are, in Freudian theory, the id is emphasized. Early Freud, id is emphasized. Later Freud, the superego is emphasized. For Fromm, we would say that the superego and the ego are the two central struggles that humans deal with, the cultural and the free will, the decision. Distinctly different from saying that biology determines us or that society determines us. We are directed by our free will, our past, and our future. We're teleological beings. In other words, we're striving towards some future goal, some idea of ourselves that could be. And humans have transcended nature in this way. We have transcended the biological drives of survival of the fittest, the options of feeding, fighting, flighting, and mating, the 4 F's of evolutionary theory. For Fromm, these are present. These are not discarded. However, they are not the central issues of the human experience. Our human experience has become dominated by social issues of prestige, of belongingness, of other things that the humanists such as Abraham Maslow speak of. We try to cope with our feelings of alienation from nature through myths, religion, art, and social membership. So for Fromm, the making of art, the watching of films, is coming to deal with our struggles that society has, and to have a sense of belongingness and relatedness with others. Maybe a great example of this would be contemporary social media. We worship to commune with others and to integrate parts of ourselves that we've become alienated from, nature, God, etc. Going to the spiritual, going to the religious service, going to the jazz club, going to the concert hall, to the theater, to the museum, to the gallery. This is an act of communing with others and reconnecting with alienated parts of the human condition. Throughout history of man, we have inched away from each other and have become independent and placed importance on uniqueness. But have we sacrificed? What have we sacrificed for our freedom? What have we lost in our striving for our individuality, for our uniqueness and our independence? Fromm claimed that the Middle Ages, from 400 to 1400, was the last period of stability and belonging. Take, for example, that during the feudal system, an individual's place and identity was determined. There may have been a little flexibility. If you were born into an agricultural family and you showed certain promise, you might be taken under the Catholic university system and become clergy, educated college clergy. But largely, if you were born into an agricultural farming family, you became a farmer. There was no question, what will I be when I grow up? Your identity wasn't questioned. One was secure. The central issue that we have today of who am I did not exist, as Fromm points out, before the Enlightenment. There was no social mobility, but great cohesion and belongingness with others. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s and the Renaissance destroyed the social structure and placed importance on the individual and their relationship with God. This is the central investigation of Fromm's text, Escape from Freedom, or as it's published in England, the fear of freedom. This is where Fromm points out that we do everything possible to get away from our freedom. The moment we have freedom, we do things like buy stuff to go into debt, get engaged to be married, have children, enter into college. The thing that we fear the most is freedom. Insecurity and neurotic striving for power and survival has been the result of this. This insecurity is a neurotic striving for survival and power, but this isn't biological survival. This is social survival. How we're viewed by others in the social network, how we dress, how we drive, the titles we have, the size of our bank accounts, etc. That's where we get our security in a socially dominated world. Fromm said that we have 3 styles of dealing with the negative aspects of freedom. In other words, when we're faced with the fear of chaotic anything is possible, we can either become authoritarian, like the authoritarian character. This is the person who tries to control everyone else. We can become destructive. This is the person who feels secure by destroying the system they're in. Or we can have automaton conformity. This is blending in to make ourselves inconspicuous. Just as certain animals camouflage themselves by blending into the environment so that they're not victimized, we blend into our environment by wearing the right sneakers, the right trousers, the right shirt, the right hat, having the right hairstyle to conform so that we can conceal ourselves and feel safe. These are the 3 psychic mechanisms for having a sense of security. In authoritarianism, it's either sadism, the desire to hurt, or masochism, the desire to be hurt. And masochists feel inferior and inadequate. They complain of this sense of inferiority, but somehow take pleasure in submitting to others. There's a sense of security in being controlled or parented by an authority. And we know that there's some individuals in our culture that take a great deal of safety and emphasis on following the rules, on submitting to some authority. Submissiveness assuages their feelings of loneliness, Fromm says. A sadist, on the other hand, strives for power and control over those who are willing to submit. They enjoy taking control of others' emotions, possessions, intellect, or enjoy seeing others suffer, and may be the cause of that suffering. And the emotional suffering, embarrassment, and humiliation are the tools of the sadistic authoritarian style. And this is not only a sexual sadomasochism, this is a moral sadomasochism. This is a personality style, the sadist and the masochist. The authoritarian style of escaping freedom always needs another to play along. You have to have a sadist and a masochist to play this game. Someone who likes to lead, someone who likes to follow, someone who feels safe in controlling, and another who feels safe in being controlled. And it's interesting to point out that in every sadist there's a masochist, and in every masochist there's a sadist. The authoritarian style of escaping freedom always needs the other. The destructive style aims at eliminating or destroying the other. I can escape my own feelings of powerlessness in comparison to others by destroying them. I will maintain a splendid isolation of complete power. And this is described in patriotism and nationalism, Hitler, nationalists that support Donald Trump, capitalism even. This is the idea that individuals who destroy that which threatens them. This is destructiveness. We can even see this in the anatomy of human destructiveness, in mass school shootings. We can understand in this way. It's a way of feeling safe in an unsafe world by destroying that which threatens us. And in an automaton conformity, we ease our painful loneliness by being just like everyone else. Animals protect themselves by blending in with their environment. When we have certain brands like Nike, Abercrombie, Skechers, Polo, etc., Ralph Lauren, we identify with a group. We become automaton conformist with this group, and it gives us a sense of belongingness, a sense of tribal protection. I become them. A vast sector of modern advertising does not appeal to reason, but to emotion. Like any other kind of hypnoid suggestion, it tries to impress its objects emotionally and then make them submit intellectually, Fromm tells us. So through authoritarianism, destructiveness, and automaton conformity, we achieve a sense of belongingness that we desperately need, but at the cost of the self. The self, the false self, as defined by what we buy, replaces the genuine self. Without our identified labels, we are lost, right where the marketers want us. Fromm wrote the introduction to George Orwell's book 1984, and this introduction is a great read to understand Frommian theory. Personality development in childhood. Fromm talks about history of the species is repeated in childhood. As we grow, we become less dependent. The less dependent we become, the more alone we feel. A child will develop a tendency towards one of three mechanisms to deal with their isolation, their fear as becoming independent and growing apart from their parents. They can either have symbiotic relatedness, withdrawal, destructiveness, or love. So the symbiotic relatedness, this mechanism that children use, is the fundamental basis of adult personality. This symbiotic relatedness is escaping freedom by swallowing or being swallowed. Being swallowed by the parent means complete submission. They become the adult masochist. They'll do whatever mommy or daddy wants to keep them happy. They feel safe by conforming to mommy and daddy's demands. And you can see how this becomes the adult masochistic attitude. Swallowing the parent means the child dominates and controls the parent and becomes an adult sadist. You won't leave me, or else. Security is maintained through the other via submission or dominance. A second is withdrawal destructiveness, and in this style of childhood reaction, the overbearing, destructive parent is met with a withdrawn child. The withdrawn parent is met by a destructive, overbearing child. So the parent who doesn't give the attention gets a child that demands the attention through destructiveness, and the child who withdraws the parent makes the demands through a destructiveness. And the way the child feels safe in this world is to destroy the things around them, to control it. And the love, the third aspect of the mechanism of interpersonal relatedness in childhood, is the parent offers respect and support to the child, and the child feels little need to escape. There's nothing to escape from. Fromm felt that childhood was important, but not the only time for personality development. And the child learns to act in society as their family does. So more than what we're taught in lessons is how the family behaves. That's where the real transmission of personality takes place, character, as Fromm calls it. Character is distinctly different from personality, of course, because personality has to do with objective, maybe trait descriptions, whereas character has to do with a moral, ethical aspect of the human condition. And this word character fell out of favor once trait theory came and psychology attempted to be more objective. And this is Fromm is exactly the critique of Fromm, that when we lost our examination of morality with the human condition, when we stopped talking about character, we stopped doing anything of value in personality psychology. So Fromm points out that there's 6 psychological needs in humans. We need to relate to others, relatedness needs, transcendence needs, rootedness needs, identity need, frame of orientation need, and excitation and stimulation need. These are largely existential needs that Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and others talked about. Relatedness needs. We are aware of the nature of birth and death, but feel removed from it. We can healthfully feel connected to nature through love, care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge with and of others. Love can be brotherly or sisterly. It can be erotic, or it can be parental. And in productive, healthful love, one is concerned with the well-being of the other. Love is a verb, not a noun. This is what he describes in his book, The Art of Loving. In other words, love is a way you act, not something you fall into. Love, that when we say falling into love, that's a neurosis. It's a trying to control and hold on to something of value, almost like someone who, once they've saved some money, becomes scared that they're going to lose that money. And this is a possessive kind of neurosis an attachment. And this is much different, of course, than loving, acting lovingly. If one does not develop the ability to love, they become narcissistic, concerned only with their own feelings. This is a self-absorbed individual. Transcendent needs. So need to rise above the passive animal state. Reason and imagination guides us. The need to be creative and productive. Those who are not creative become destructive. And remember, Hitler was a failed artist. Enrootedness needs, relationships with others and parent-child relationship. Nationalism is a form of incest. So in other words, people who don't feel a sense, who need a sense of belonging are attracted to things like patriotism and patriotism and nationalism. Their need to not feel alone, to feel safe, to feel part of the group is so strong and so unmet in their lives that they turn to things like identifying with a nation state, of nationalism, a tribal kind of mentality. This could even be extended into athletic teams or ideological perspectives, Republican, Democrat, etc. Identity need, again, very closely related. Identification with a group, developing unique talents, not conformity. Conformity is not a unique self, but developing the authentic self is a need. And the need to frame of orientation. We have a sense of purpose only through devoting ourselves to some other, whether that's child, or to our spouse, to God, to our profession. Finally, the need for excitation. The brain requires a certain level of stimulus to function well. We manage between ourselves and others and our environment. So we have these 6 basic psychological needs that Fromm describes: relatedness to others, transcendence of our biological self, a rootedness, a sense of belonging, an identity need, a frame of orientation, a purpose, and a need for stimulation. Fromm describes different character types. And in different times of his theory, in different times of his writing, he names these in different ways. So I'm going to tell you 9 of these. The first 6 are non-productive types. They're the unhealthful, neurotic types of character. The productive types, there are 3 productive types, and I'll tell you those first. These are the healthful types, and these are individuals who are socially oriented, who have social concerns for others, not narcissistic, but have a social concern for helping, for being a part of society. The productive character produces. They're creative. The biophilous character is an individual who celebrates creation and life rather than death and destructiveness. And the being character is someone who bases their sense of self on how they act, on what they do in society. I don't mean what they do as a profession, but what they do as a function of society. Not being a teacher, but teaching. Not being a therapist, but doing therapy. They are what they do. This is the being characters. And that's much different than these are much different character types than the adult non-productive types or neurotic character types. The having character, for example, bases themselves not on what they do, but on what they have. The objects they have, the amount of money they have, the cars, the social status, the degrees, etc. It's all about having. And Fromm asks in the question in his book, To Have or to Be, if one bases their sense of self on what they have and they lose what they have, what do they have left as a sense of self? It's a main distinction of a neurotic character type. The necrophilous character. Well, for the necrophilious character, they're attracted to inanimate objects, technology, computers, death, skulls, feces, dirt, electronics, cyber chat, sex with robot type things, pornographic media, the electronic orgasm. So this is the necrophilious character, oriented towards things that aren't alive. Fromm also talks about the having character, which I described before. Possessions are the point of life. Cars, jewels, and people. I am what I possess and I consume. Maybe this is illustrated by the saying, the cliche saying from the 80s, those with the most toys win. This would be a having character. The receptive character type, they expect to get whatever they want from external sources, need to be loved rather than to love. They take rather than give. They're dependent on others, cannot function without someone else's help. We'd call this oral incorporative in Freudian language. The exploitative character type, take from others what they need. It is demanded, stolen, not accepted. This would be like the oral aggressive type. The hoarding character type, the security through hoarding and savings on emotions and money, the anal retentive type. So this person feels safe by conservative, keep holding in of their resources, emotionally unavailable individuals, the individuals who hoard money or hoard ideas, etc. The marketing character type, this is 20th century, 21st century human. Capitalism, American, the person is a commodity, be bought and sold on the commodity market. When you ask what is someone's worth, and they answer in dollars, that's the marketing character type. Everything is the goal of making oneself more marketable for their CV, for their resume. Superficial qualities give us value. It's a game that leads to anxiety and depression, Fromm discusses. The having character types, of course, again, I am what I have. This is contrasted with the being character types, define themselves by what they are, not what they have. An internal sense of self, sharing with others. Again, the biophilus character type is productive, love life and growth, creation. They want to help others and to develop, opposite of the necrophilius character. The biophilus character are the people that when we leave their company, we feel uplifted, we feel hopeful, we see possibilities. When we're with a necrophilius character, we feel yucky. We feel depressed, down, no hope. And that's a good intuitive gut feeling for getting to even understand whom we invite into our garden, into our lives by thinking how we feel when we're with that person. Productivity is not doing something. It's an attitude. That's the productive character type. And it's the ultimate ideal of human being. Producing doesn't mean making to sell. This means creating for the sake of creation. So Fromm is big on free will and also how we become unconscious puppets of society. He places emphasis on both biological and social conditions, with the primary influence on unconsciously ingested social ideals. Past and present and future are equally important. We're growth-oriented, we're optimistic human beings, and we're simultaneously unique and universal. Some of the books that I would recommend to individuals who are interested in reading Erich Fromm, if you're interested in contemporary issue of human aggression, school shootings, his text, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, is the best I've seen out there. Fromm, if you're interested in Buddhism, Fromm introduced psychoanalysis in Buddhism, and you can read his text with D.T. Suzuki and Richard DiMartino on Buddhism and psychoanalysis. To Have or to Be is a great book that addresses identity in the 20th and 21st centuries of having versus being character type. His treatment of the early writings of Karl Marx as a great humanist psychologist and Marx's concept of man is a great book. Fromm on Freud and Marx, Beyond the Chains of Illusion, deal with social unconscious and also Freudian biological unconscious. In his book, The Sane Society, he addresses the issues of healthful reactions to unhealthful societies rather than mentally ill individuals in normal societies. Escape from Freedom, again, is his critique of the Enlightenment. In Man for Himself, he discusses character types, that we discussed in our lecture here. The Art of Loving is where he famously analyzes love as a verb rather than as a noun. May Man Prevail is a book that he wrote discussing the threat of nuclear atomic annihilation. For The Forgotten Language, an incredible book that is not so commonly read today, is his investigation of children's myth, childhood fairy tales, and dream analysis, the forgotten language of the unconscious. The Art of Listening, on being human, the pathology of normalcy. This is the striving to try to be normal in itself becomes a pathology. The Revolution of Hope, The Art of Being, on disobedience. These are all books that further illustrate Fromm's later writing. My favorite book that Fromm wrote is called The Heart of Man, where he analyzes determinism, biological determinism, social determinism, and free will. So these are, he also wrote an incredible book on the psychology of religion and its importance of spiritual belief. So this is a little introduction to Fromm. I hope this is a general overview. I hope it sparks the interest. If I had to recommend a book to start with, you might want to take a look at the Erich Fromm Reader, readings selected and edited by Rainer Funk. And that gives you a good little taste of all the aspects of Fromm. Thanks for listening.